And even. She stopped and took a minute to compose herself, wiping a few stray tears away from her eyes before looking back up at Hunter again and smiling. What I'm trying to say is that I'm sorry and that I am also so very grateful for saving Ash the way you did. I am more overjoyed than you can possibly imagine that I will not have to carry the burden of this young man's death on my conscience for the rest of my life. Thank you. Fuji followed his old friend's suit and bowed his head. Yes, thank you, Hunter. I think you have now officially started on the path of redemption by saving the life of the one who believed in you and risked so much for your own life. Hunter, obviously surprised at so many people being kind to it and thanking it at one time, just nodded its head slowly but maintained a stoic facade regardless. Brock spoke up then and got everyone's attention. As great as this moment is, you guys, Dawn will be on us soon and we need to get Ash back to the house so he can rest. He's been through a lot and we might even have to check him over for any injuries we can't see right now. Giselle looked at him oddly. Injuries we can't see? You mean like, it hit her like a ton of bricks? What Brock meant after a few moments of thought, and her face instantly reddened like a beet afterwards. Oh, yeah, that. Misty went over to her tired and battered looking Pokémon and then patted her Starmie gently. We really need to get our Pokémon taken care of and rested too, it's been a long night. Agatha nodded. Yes, a very good idea. Fuji, can you? However, she was cut off by the kindly old man before she could say anything else as he simply held a hand up. Of course I will, Agatha, no need to even ask. Walking over to Ash then, he leaned down and lifted the boy up onto his back, grunting as he did so. Oh, dear Arceus, this boy is solid as a golem. Brock moved to help him but the old man just shook his head. I'm alright, Brock, don't you worry. We need to focus on getting home right now. By tomorrow I foresee the town being in an uproar over what happened to the tower. Misty suddenly stopped them all before anyone could do anything else. Wait, what about Hunter? The others turned around and looked up at the massive ghost type thoughtfully. Brock mused thoughtfully as he rubbed his chin in thought. That's a good question. Hunter is essentially homeless now with the destruction of the tower. Giselle snorted. I don't think it'd want to stay there even if the tower was still up and standing. It was dark, cold, drafty, and I think Hunter spent way too much time there as it is already. Everyone else nodded in agreement to Giselle's words and then thought about it for a few more minutes until Fuji ventured forth curiously but also hesitantly. Well, I suppose Hunter could stay in the gym back home if it wanted to, after all there is plenty of room. Agatha nodded to Fuji's suggestion. Yes, that could work indeed, I would wager. Fuji looked back up at Hunter. What do you say, Hunter? Would you like to come and stay with us at my home? There's plenty of room and you won't be noticed by anyone. He then decided to sweeten the deal a little. You'll be right near Ash the whole time and once he wakes up, you can even see him again. Those words, especially the part about being near Ash, seemed to have won Hunter over because it simply gave another nod of its large head and then went still again. The old man smiled. Very good then. He turned to the others while adjusting the unconscious young Ketchum on his back. Let's go everyone, before this area starts seeing a heavy amount of traffic in the form of curious townspeople. Everyone else agreed and then once Giselle, Misty and Agatha returned their Pokémon, they set out for Fuji's home. Pikachu on Giselle's shoulder and Charmander in her arms since they apparently felt the most comfortable with her out of everyone else while Ash was out of commission. Hunter took one last look at the ruins of the tower which had been the bane of its existence for so long and then focused outward on the horizon where the light of a new day was just starting to rise over the distant mountains. Looking back towards the group of humans as they made their way back to Fuji's home then, Hunter began to follow them. More than a little curious and with a fair amount of hope at what this new phase in its life would end up leading to. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX slumber. Opening his eyes, the raven-haired boy blinked a few times as his dizzy brain tried to adjust to just exactly where he was. Turning his head, Ash rolled around onto his back and hissed in pain as he did so. Glancing up, he saw nothing but a dark wooden ceiling above him, and when he finally looked down, he saw that he was wrapped in some warm blankets on a very comfortable bed. At that realization, Ash suddenly was able to put two and two together and figured that he must have been back in the room that he and his friends had all shared together the night before when they had stayed with Fuji. His mind swimming, Ash turned his attention from figuring out where he was to trying to remember what had happened to him. It took some time and more than a little pounding within his head due to a headache which he felt throbbing at the base of his skull, but eventually he was able to recall the last memory he had before falling unconscious. Which was right after Haunter had calmed down completely during their fourth star state connection, and he then passed out due to the total exhaustion he finally fell victim to. Everything else was a blank afterwards, and desperately wanting to know what happened to Haunter, his Pokémon and his friends after he fell unconscious, Ash forced himself into a sitting position. Something that was very complicated to do since his entire body felt tired, sore and itchy all over. Once he was up though, the boy rested back against the headboard and looked around the room, getting visual confirmation that yes, he was definitely in the guest bedroom at Fuji's home once more. What took him by surprise however was the sight of his friends and Pikachu all in the room, sleeping, in almost identical positions as they had been in when he woke up the last time in this near exact same situation. Pikachu was at his feet near the end of the bed, Giselle was asleep beside of him on a chair with her head down while Misty was resting on the window seat, head leaning against the glass, and Brock was in his sleeping bag on the floor. Which was the only difference from last time since before, both he and Misty had been sleeping on the window seat. Almost in an exact copy of the way things happened the day before as well, Pikachu felt the bed shift when Ash moved and his eyes opened almost right away. Looking up the bed and seeing his trainer awake, Pikachu bolted up and jumped at Ash while crying out, "Pika Pie." Ash was taken by surprise at Pikachu's sudden quick movement but caught his Pokémon and hugged him close while smiling warmly, "Hey buddy, I was worried about you." "Pika Pika. Pikachu Pie." The little yellow Pokémon cried again happily as he nuzzled his face into Ash's chest. While the boy continued to smile and reassured his Pokémon that everything was okay, the commotion they were making awoke the others in the room. As soon as Giselle, Misty and Brock opened their eyes and saw Ash awake, they immediately shot up and ran over to him while practically shouting, "Ash, you're awake!" Misty exclaimed excitedly as she threw herself at him and wrapped her arms around the boy's neck. Not one to be outdone though, Giselle quickly got up on the bed and took Ash's face in her hands after Misty freed him from the stranglehold she had on him. With no further ado, the brunette quickly leaned down and claimed the young trainer's lips with her own as their mouths became reacquainted with one another yet again after such a near-permanent loss of connection between them due to Ash's near-death. Surprised at first due to Misty's vicious hug and then Giselle throwing herself at him, Ash quickly recovered from his shock and wrapped his arms around her before returning the passionate kiss she was gifting him with. Giselle's right hand quickly came up and gripped onto Ash's unruly black hair as she continued to kiss him fiercely. Brock and even Misty just looked on with smiles on their faces at the sweet moment between the two, the particular circumstance of it not being enough to weird them out. Misty for her part understood and for once wasn't jealous of Giselle since, even though she was very worried and then distraught about Ash when they thought he had died, she could only imagine what Giselle, as his girlfriend, must have been feeling at the same time. After all, even though she strongly believed her own feelings matched her female friend and self-made rival's own for their shared love interest, Misty also knew the very close bond that Ash and Giselle had growing between them. And after having such a bond nearly shattered, she didn't want to intervene and mess up the very tender moment they were currently sharing. When Ash and Giselle finally broke apart, she laid her forehead against his and whispered breathlessly, "I was so afraid that I nearly lost you, Ash, thank Arceus, thank Arceus." Ash kept his arms wrapped around Giselle and hugged her while murmuring comforting words to her, "I know Giselle, but I'm okay. I promise, everything is fine now." When she finally released Ash and then curled up beside of him with her head rested on his shoulder, their kiss saying more than words really ever could, Brock took that moment to give his own well wishes. "You had us worried like crazy, Ash. I thought we would never see you again, man." Ash looked at the older boy oddly. Why would that have been? His friends looked at each other, knowing that Ash had no clue they had left him when they thought there was no hope to save him down in the chamber. Each of them seemed very uncomfortable with how to tell him what happened, and eventually, Giselle decided to do it. Well, Ash, you see, when the chamber was caving in, we all knew we had to get out. After you and Haunter came out of that connection thing you were in, you were unconscious and fell to the ground with Haunter helping to levitate you down so you didn't get hurt. Brock and Mr. Fuji tried to get to you in time to save you, but the ceiling started to collapse twice as fast and blocked you off from us. There was no way we could get to you. Misty picked up from there. That's why Brock said we almost lost you. We had to leave with." She paused for a minute and had to clear her throat to keep from breaking down at the sheer thought of it. "Without you." Ash's eyes widened, not caring that they had left them since he understood why they did so right away. No, his shock came from instantly having several questions, urgent questions, that he needed answered and demanded for as he commenced to speaking hurriedly. What happened to Charmander and Ghastly? Are they okay? What about all of the other Pokémon? Are Mr. Fuji and Agatha all right? What about Haunter, and how did I get out? Before anyone else could respond, the door suddenly opened and in came Fuji and Agatha. As soon as they saw him, Fuji smiled slightly and nodded towards the boy. "I thought we heard some commotion coming from in here. How are we feeling, young man?" Ash was about to answer, but he was unable to as Agatha quickly rushed over to the bed and bent down, wrapping Ash up in a grandmotherly hug and thoroughly surprising him that someone as famous as her, a member of the Elite Four no less, was doing such a thing. The old woman squeezed Ash tightly before pulling back enough to look at him with tears in her eyes. "Oh, thank Arceus, you are okay, dear boy. I was worried sick about you." She hugged him again and started to frantically apologize. "I am so sorry I made the decision to leave you, Ash. I was merely acting in what I thought was the best interest of everyone. I thought of every possible way to get to you, but I could not foresee one single attempt that would do so without burying us all alive down in that chamber." Pulling away a little bit, she looked at Ash again with a few tears now rolling down her cheeks. "Can you ever forgive this foolish old woman for doing something so terrible? I wouldn't blame you the slightest if you didn't." Ash was still very surprised at Agatha's sudden display of affection and the tearful, frantic apologies she was offering him, so it took a few minutes for his brain to catch up with what was happening. When it did though, he finally was able to reply to her and just shook his head. "I'm not upset or mad at you at all, Agatha. I understand why you all did what you did. I know that none of you would have left me unless it seemed absolutely hopeless and beyond the realm of possibility to rescue me. If anything, I'm just thankful that you got my friends and Pokémon out safely and didn't allow anything bad to happen to them. I'm grateful to you, Agatha, not mad." The old woman gave a small, warm smile at Ash after he said that while just shaking her head and placing her hands gently on his cheeks like a mother would do. "You really are a remarkable young man, Ash, that much is for certain. I can see Samuel Oak in you the more and more I'm around you, even though I know you aren't related. I don't feel as though I deserve your gratitude or praise, but I do still appreciate it more than you can ever know. Thank you, dear boy." Ash just smiled at her and nodded before looking at his friends and Fuji. "That goes for all of you guys. Please don't feel bad for what you did. The entire chamber was coming down around us from the way I'm hearing it, and you had to leave. I know that none of you would abandon me if there was even a slight chance at rescuing me, so it must have been a really, really bad situation. I'm not upset at all, so please don't blame yourselves, okay, none of you." Misty and Giselle both sat next to Ash and hugged either side of him while Brock smiled a little and nodded at his words. Fuji also gave a small smile at the boy's forgiving nature and then walked over to the chair next to the bed that Giselle had recently vacated. Taking a seat, he leaned on a cane that he had been using ever since the night before down in the chamber. His body still having not recovered yet from the intense exertion his aged self had went through. "I also thank you for your words of forgiveness, Ash. I was feeling just as guilty as everyone else, so to hear you say such a thing not only places my mind at ease somewhat, but it makes me respect you that much more as person and as a Pokémon trainer." Fuji consented with a slight bow of gratitude to the boy in question. Ash stretched his legs out, wincing a little at the soreness in them, before asking, "How long have I been out for?" Yet again, Fuji answered almost immediately, "I'll answer that and your other questions, Ash. You were out for a full day, that being all of yesterday, and woke up just a little after noon on today, which is Friday. All of our Pokémon is fine, each and every one. Myself and Agatha are doing just fine except for the occasional little aches and pains we've been feeling, but, then again, it is to be expected." The old man smiled amusedly. "We're not as young as we once were." Agatha, who was sitting at the end of the bed, nearly rubbed at her knees as she replied whimsically, "No. Unfortunately, no, we are not." Fuji smiled at his friend's statement before looking back at Ash. As for how Hunter is doing and exactly how you survived, well, both are interchangeably related as a matter of fact. Ash tilted his head to the side curiously and Fuji elaborated. He started off into as quick of an explanation as he could of the events which transpired after they managed to flee the tower, doing his best to tell about the mind-boggling events that led up to Ash's miraculous survival. It was easy to see Ash's surprise and flat-out shock as Fuji, helped along by the others, told the rather long tale as best as he could. His eyes completely bulged when he found out that not just the ceiling chamber but the entire tower had collapsed, but Fuji merely held his hand up and told him that he would explain that particular portion of the story shortly. By the time it was all said and done, Ash was just sitting there in stunned silence, hardly believing how close he came to almost dying, as well as the extreme lengths Hunter went to in order to save him. After several moments though, a small smile crossed his face as he asked quietly, "So, I succeeded in helping Hunter after all?" Fuji nodded while crossing his arms. "Oh, you did much more than that, my boy." Seeing Ash look at him in puzzlement, the old man smiled again before explaining, "Hunter is doing more than okay. Right now it's down in the gym where it's been staying since it came back with us. All of your Pokémon have been making every attempt to make it feel welcome, and after a short time, your friend's Pokémon all followed their example and started doing the same. It's safe to say that I believe Hunter is now quite comfortable here. It took a while, but it's finally beginning to relax and loosen up a little. Slowly but surely." Ash smiled fondly, proud of his Pokémon doing such a thing without being asked. "But how is Hunter though? And Charmander and Ghastly for that matter? I know they were all really exhausted and beat up, at least in the case of my Pokémon. Pikachu I can see is fine, but I'm still worried about the others. We got all of our Pokémon, including yours, taken to the Pokémon Center bright and early the very next morning." Brock spoke up from the other side of the bed across from Fuji and Agatha. He then grinned perversely. "Nurse Joy was nice, real nice." As Brock's mouth slightly hung open and his face began turning red with a blush at the memory of the Lavender Town Nurse Joy, everyone else watched him with beads of sweat running down the back of their heads. The more into the memories Brock became, Misty's hand started reaching towards his ear while twitching. All it took was Brock uttering one, "Oh Nurse Joy," before said hand promptly latched onto his ear and then yanked the teen down to the floor, where he was pulled towards the door by an irritated Misty. "No one wants to hear your perverted little fantasies, Brock, you big creepo." She then pulled the struggling, yelping Brock out of the room and shut the door before the pleas for mercy and shouts of pain from the former Pewter City gym leader filled the rest of the house as Misty commenced to giving him a good, well-deserved pounding. At least, well-deserved in her mind. Everyone in the room looked towards the door before Ash, Giselle and Pikachu hung and shook their heads in exasperated frustration at Brock's never-ending perverted antics. Fuji meanwhile just chuckled amusedly while Agatha raised an eyebrow and shook her own head slightly. "That young man has some serious issues regarding the opposite sex," she stated rather bluntly. Ash and Giselle simply sighed before speaking in unison along with Pikachu, "We know, Pika." Fuji chuckled again before he heard Ash ask, "So what about Hunter? How did you all manage to help it?" The old man leaned on his cane a little more until his chin was resting on his clasped together hands and then answered, "The Nurse Joy here in town is a very kind and helpful woman, just like most of her unusually numerous kin. She's heard the stories of Black Fog like almost everyone else here has, but she was not so harsh in judgment as most would be. When we took the Pokémon to the center that morning for treatment, Agatha and I explained to her the situation of what had happened the night before." He smiled a little amusedly. "Well, at least we did once your friend Brock finished making a rather sad attempt at wooing the poor nurse." Fuji chuckled again before continuing, "The entire town was already in a buzz as to what happened to the tower, so Joy was partially aware of the fact that something had happened. We omitted many parts of the story obviously, but the general outline of events was revealed to her." He then smiled genuinely. "She was clearly quite surprised at first at the tale we told her, but being that she has known me ever since she first came to take over the center many years ago, Nurse Joy had grown to trust me and knew I wouldn't lie to her. Without even asking outright, she volunteered to come here and look Hunter over after hearing our story, and when she did, she confirmed several things for us." The older man sat back in his chair and sighed. The first being that Hunter was completely fine aside from being exhausted. It had no wounds that wouldn't heal on their own despite the large-scale battle we waged against it. Surprisingly enough, once we informed Hunter of why Nurse Joy was here, it didn't put up a fight and was very well behaved when she checked it over. Ash intervened at that point, but what else did she find out about it? Aside from the fact that Hunter is much, much larger than not only any ghost type I've ever seen but any other Pokémon in general. Agatha offered in response to his question and ended in a somewhat questioning note herself. Many things really. She was able to tell from the simple test she performed without any heavy equipment that Hunter is far, far from an ordinary Pokémon. Biologically it is made up very differently from any other ghost type in specific. Generally its body functions much the same as any other ghost Pokémon, which it would have to in order make it a member of that particular species. Everything after that though is supposedly a mystery. Ash looked quite confused at her final words and Fuji elaborated, the differences lie not only in Hunter's mass and obvious supercharged physical capabilities and attacks but also in how it operates on a regular day-to-day basis. We learned for instance that Hunter can apparently go an abnormally long time without food or sleep and it also has a unique sensitivity to sunlight. Something attained most likely from years of living in darkness no doubt. In time it may fade but it's hard to tell. Joy could only tell so much without actually doing a full-on exam back at the center and even then, she's a healthcare professional, not a Pokémon professor or scientist. Ash nodded and then sat up a little more. Well, I really do appreciate you doing all that for Hunter. What about the tower though? How did people handle it? Fuji just chuckled again and shook his head. About how you'd expect. With shock, panic, fear and in some cases, even joy. That tower had become a black mark on the town for many, many years so several people were glad to see it topple. The only thing almost the entire town has in common concerning yesterday's events is wondering exactly what happened. Everyone felt the massive earthquake that rocked the entire tower earlier in the night during our battle against Hunter and the 3 ghost types it had created as its bodyguards. Even more townspeople recalled seeing the bright pillar of light shoot up into the sky the night before when I rescued you from Hunter's clutches down in the catacombs. He sighed in exasperation. So essentially, half the town seems to be divided into those that believe it was a simple act of nature which took the form of a random earthquake rocking through the area and being the cause for the tower's fall, but then others see it as some act of divine intervention. A great act of the powers that be finally smiting a dark monument which was nothing more than a memorial for pain, suffering and tragic events of the past. Fuji shrugged. But whoever believes what really doesn't matter, because the fact does remain that even though Pokémon Tower's origins started out noble and true, being a resting place and memorial ground for the souls of departed Pokémon and the humans who cared for them in having a place to pay their respects, it did not remain that way. For whatever reason, fate, destiny, the divine or whatever you may believe in, something chose to make that tower the pinnacle for a series of unforgettable tragedies that it simply couldn't bounce back from. Truth be told, the only reason the tower was never taken down years before now was largely due to the community itself. Lavender Town is somewhat known for being rather spooky and ominous because of not only Pokémon Tower itself but also because that in all of Kanto, one of the best places to find ghost types is in the forests and other nearby areas around this town. Occasionally you'll even hear of one or a group of them moving into a local building here in town that's been abandoned and then making it their home. I know for a fact that many places here in this abandoned part of town serve as home to several ghost Pokémon, but no one ever bothers to clear them out. In fact, it never happens unless they come to harbor somewhere within the main part of the town itself where people actually live. Once more Fuji sighed. It is a sad thing truly, but once you've been labeled for so long as something unpleasant, you slowly start to believe it over time. Because outsiders have given this town the reputation of being spooky, creepy and all around ghostly in origin, the people living here have almost come to play the part. Many that live here are very superstitious, and because of this, years ago when the last accident surrounding the tower occurred and everyone left this part of town, no one wanted to vote to have it taken down for fear of reprisals at the hands of whatever great evil came to live within it. Now that the tower has finally fallen, however, many of those same superstitious believers are taking it as a good omen and a sign that the dark cloud which hovered over this town for many years because of Pokémon Tower has finally passed. Even now I hear that the town council is deciding on what course of action to take now that the tower is no more. Some are saying to make it into a memorial site while others are trying to vote to get it rebuilt. Fuji smiled yet again. Whatever happens though, I do believe things here in Lavender Town are going to get much better. Even for all of the rumors and theories going around about what might happen to the site of where the tower once stood, one thing is for almost certain. Nearly the entire town seems to be unanimous on deciding to finally start cleaning up, repairing and even bringing this particular part of town back to life. Which would be wonderful, if it does happen, for our local economy. After all, getting use and making profit from both sides of a town works far better than when only using one. Fuji then looked at Ash and grinned. I suppose that for just this once, the local train of superstition seems to be right. For all the years Haunter was locked under that tower stewing in its own hatred and misery, this town suffered and was a shadow of its former self. Now that Haunter has been freed of its pain and given a new form of peace in its life, the unofficial object of this town's oppression in the form of the tower has since crumbled down and now everyone has hope again. He pointed a finger at Ash. And unknowingly, my boy, they have you to thank for it. Ash just shook his head. No, they don't. It was a combined effort of all of us working together to help Haunter. It wasn't me by myself. If I would have been alone, I'd be dead right now, and who knows about Haunter. Giselle smiled softly and reached for his hand. We have helped you, Ash, and been there for support, both physical and emotional when you needed it, but you were the one that freed Haunter. You were the one that risked your life time and time again to establish a connection with its heart and help take away Haunter's pain. None of us would have been able to do that, Ash. It was all you for that part. When we were ready to give up, you kept pushing forward and you didn't stop. You had hope for Haunter and you weren't going to give up on it. Whether you want to admit it or not, you were the reason, solely, for Haunter finally having hope again and the chance at a new life. Giselle continued to smile at Ash as she kept going with her speech. I think that in some ways, the two of you are intertwined now. Just looking at Haunter and how it acts when your name is spoken, not to mention how worried about you I know it's been, makes me honestly believe that you two really did connect your hearts somehow, and now, Haunter is tied to you. It's like Fuji said, because of the light and release from darkness you brought to Haunter, the town is now free of the unknowing oppression and negativity its rage and anger brought. This town really does have another shot at life again, just like Haunter, and it is because you were willing to stand up and be there for something that everyone else gave up on a long time ago. Fuji nodded and then stroked his chin. Wise words for one so young, and she is right, Ash. In some odd way, you, Haunter, and this town are now connected in a very unique way, and I'm sure it isn't a coincidence. Lavender Town was the cradle for Haunter's refuge for so long, and due to that, it was forced into a form of desolation and despair by the dark shadows its malice brought down upon us all the day of the fateful fire in Pokémon Tower. And after the town had already been blackened and stained by Team Rocket's act of cruelty and evil years prior. The kind old man looked up at the ceiling with a fond, thoughtful expression on his face. But then you came and pulled those same dark curtains back and allowed the light to shine over the town once more with the toppling of the tower and the redemption of Haunter's soul. In fact, I would wager to say that had you failed and left with us the other night when the tower was collapsing and Haunter would have succeeded in killing itself, I believe that would have been the final nail in the proverbial coffin that could have forever sealed Lavender Town's dark fate that had been ruling it for so long. Ash smiled politely and rubbed the back of his head. Yeah, well, I don't know about all that. I'm just glad that everything turned out for the best in the end. Is there any way I can go and see Haunter and my Pokémon now? Fuji shrugged again before replying, that's up to you, Ash. How are you feeling? The boy stretched his legs and arms out a little and nodded. I'm okay. A little sore and tired still, but I'm good enough to get up and move a bit. He looked down at that point, noticing he was only in his boxers and black undershirt. Where are my clothes? Giselle quickly got off the bed and ran over to the dresser in the corner of the room and took his tracksuit off the top of it before running back over to the bed. Here you go, Ash. We washed them up for you, and Agatha even repatched the cuts and tears in the material. Ash looked at Agatha as he took his clothes from Giselle and smiled widely. Hey, thanks so much for fixing my clothes, Agatha. The older woman just smiled and waved him off. Oh, Ash, you don't have to thank me, I was happy to do it for you. If they need any more repairs, just let me know. The boy got up off the bed and pulled his tracksuit on before looking himself over in the mirror that was attached to the back of the door. Wow, this thing looks good as new, you did great. She smiled again and nodded. You're very welcome, young man, very welcome indeed. Fuji took that time to stand up and stretch. Well, what do you say? I'll say we go down and let Ash have a much anticipated reunion between the rest of his Pokémon and Haunter. Ash finished putting his shoes on and then headed towards the door before anyone could answer Fuji's question. I'm ready, let's go. He then opened up the door and headed out onto the elevated walkway that was suspended above the ground level of the house. Fuji, Giselle and Agatha followed him with Pikachu jumping up onto his shoulder, and when they were almost to the stairs that lead down to the living room, they all saw Misty sitting on top of Brock while twisting his arm. The teen boy was yelping in pain as Misty shouted, "Learned your lesson yet, Brock?" While physically torturing him. Ash stopped and shook his head in amusement before sighing and placing his hands on his hips. Misty, please let Brock up, we're going to see Haunter and the other Pokémon now. Misty almost immediately stopped torturing Brock and stood up before appearing next to Ash's side with a big, sweet smile on her face seemingly the very next moment. Sure thing, Ash. Chuckling, Ash led Giselle and Misty down the stairs with Agatha in tow while Fuji brought up the rear. The old man stopped just long enough to see Brock laying there on the top step with a little bit of drool hanging limply from his mouth while comically groaning in pain. Ah, he mumbled in a daze. How does Ash do that? It's not fair. Fuji merely chuckled and responded simply, learn the ways to a woman's heart, young man, learn the ways. He then followed the others down the steps without another word while Brock peeled his beaten and mangled self up from the ground. Once Ash reached the door to the gym, he opened it up and stepped inside. As soon as he walked in, he saw all of his Pokémon plus Misty, Giselle and Brock's gathered around the middle of the large hangar-like gym where Haunter, in all of its massive glory, was hovering as they talked to it. Ash smiled at the sight and called out, "Hey, you guys talking about anything good?" Almost instantly, all of his Pokémon turned around, and as soon as they saw him, the entire group got up and rushed towards their trainer as fast as possible while making an uproarious chorus of varied calls at him. A scene of which was identical to the other day when they all did the same thing after he awoke from the unconscious state Haunter had caused him. Also, just like that day, Ash was smart enough to lay down on the ground just as his Pokémon converged upon him so that they wouldn't trample him to death. A decision that turned out to be very wise as they all jumped on him at one time and caused the air to be forcibly expelled from his lungs. Hey guys. Missed you all too. He huffed and then started greeting each one while hugging them close and grinning once he regained his breath. How've you all been? Everything going okay? His Pokémon all began talking to him hurriedly in their own unique ways of speech, and even though Ash couldn't understand any of them except for Ghastly, he treasured the gift of getting to hear his Pokémon's voices after having such a close brush with death. The feeling of having them all surround him was one of which he couldn't replace, and just sat there, happily listening to them rattle on while sitting close to him. We were all very worried about you, Ash, Ghastly said in his usual sophisticated, somewhat operatic tone. For a time none of us knew what was going to happen until your friends came down and informed us that you just needed a long rest. I can tell you that I have never been so relieved in all the years of my long life once I found out that you were safe. Ash smiled and nodded to Ghastly. I'm really glad to still be here too, Ghastly, and it's all thanks to you guys. He gestured at the ghost type and then looked down and smiled at Pikachu and Charmander. My friends, and even Haunter. If not for everything you all did to keep me safe down in that chamber and then Haunter itself saving me when the tower collapsed, I wouldn't be here right now. He then looked back down at Charmander again and gently rubbed his Pokémon on the head. I owe you an especially big thank you, Charmander. If it wasn't for you sticking by my side there at the end when Pikachu was forced asleep and Ghastly was still stunned from one of Haunter's attacks, I never would have been able to get to it at the end and finally heal its soul. So for that, thank you. The fire type just did a mimicry of his trainer and rubbed the back of his head while smiling modestly. Ash chuckled fondly at him and then looked at all of his Pokémon. Listen everybody, I really want to say thank you for being here for Haunter and making it feel welcome while I've been out of it. I heard that you guys really went out of your to make Haunter feel accepted, and after everything it's been through, I'm sure it really appreciated all the kindness. He nodded to Brock, Misty and Giselle's Pokémon a little ways away. You guys too, thank you for making Haunter feel welcomed as well. His friend's Pokémon gave a return nod to the boy they had all come to respect, and then Ghastly got his attention again. You know, Ash, Haunter has been very anxious to see you again. Why don't you go and talk to it for a while? Ash stood up. Yeah, good idea, I will. He then walked across the gym to where Haunter was at and stood before the truly impressive and immensely large ghost type. Now that he wasn't in a situation where he was scrambling to try and achieve something before Haunter could kill he and everyone else, Ash finally was able to stand back and get a good look at Haunter. Truthfully, the Pokémon in question was very a unique one. Not just with its great size either, but also how it actually looked different from other Haunter. The red eyes, spiky-looking points all over its body, and the much larger frame Haunter possessed was what truly set it apart from others of its species and physically made it look much different than, say, Fuji's Haunter. Seeing the very old Pokémon looking down at him, Ash smiled and waved up at it. Heya Haunter, how's everything going? You look good. The ancient ghost type didn't say anything but inclined its head to Ash's statement with what appeared to be its own version of a small smile on its unfortunately permanent wicked-looking face. The boy scratched at his arm and then said a little hesitantly, you know, Haunter, I really owe you a big time thank you. If it wasn't for you saving me there the other night, I'd probably be buried along with everything else under what used to be Pokémon Tower right now, and well, you went through a lot to save me and I just wanted to say thank you. Yet again Haunter nodded and then made a gesturing motion at Ash's body with its hands. Eventually catching on to what Haunter was trying to ask after a few moments of thought, Ash finally realized that he was being asked if he was doing okay now. Smiling widely, he gave a simple thumbs up before replying, now don't you worry about me, Haunter, I'm doing totally fine now. A little tired and beaten up, but that's okay. I'm fine though, I promise. He could see what he thought was relief come across Haunter's face at those words, and then sat himself down before going off into what would become an hour-long conversation of sorts, using mostly body language to communicate with the stoic Pokémon. Even though he never replied with any kind of speech, pokey or otherwise, Ash knew that Haunter was listening to what he had to say intently and would actually answer him in its own way. Being it through nods of the head or gestures with its hands. Sometimes Haunter would even just give him a look, which Ash knew meant he was giving him the answer to his question or a reply without outright speaking to him. Ash did this for quite some time with his Pokémon all sitting around him, as well as with his friend's own, before Giselle opened up the door of the gym right on the turn of 8 o'clock and called out, Ash, dinner. The boy turned around and waved at his girlfriend. Coming, Giselle. He then looked back at Haunter. I gotta go, but all the Pokémon are gonna stay and keep you company for now. I'll be back so we can talk some more, okay, Haunter? Like tonight if you'd like. The large Pokémon simply nodded to Ash and gave its own odd, creepy, yet still unique smile to him. The boy stood up and then said goodbye to his Pokémon before he, Pikachu, Charmander, Squirtle and Bulbasaur went back into the living quarters of the house for supper. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Half an hour later, after Ash and Brock made the Pokémon their food and then served a dish each to the ones in the gym, including Agatha and Fuji's, who were given permission to try both boys' unique recipes, they helped the others set the table in the kitchen-living room combination before settling down for a very delicious-looking meal prepared by Brock, Fuji and Agatha. A meal of which consisted of brown rice, broiled potatoes, tossed salad, thin wheat bread rolls and soft-boiled Pidgey eggs. Oolong and jade tea coming in right after as the refreshing warm beverages of choice to wash down such a fulfilling meal. As they all sat together and ate, Ash swallowed a mouthful of food and then exclaimed praisingly, The food is delicious, you guys did awesome preparing it. Agatha smiled at him and replied gratefully, why thank you, Ash. I didn't do too much though, the real praise goes to Fuji and Brock. The old brain here has always been the better cook out of the two of us. My finer cooking knowledge has been sadly limited over the years due to all of the constant traveling I've always done. Never really stayed in one place for too long to have a chance to learn. Fuji chuckled and looked over at his friend. Now Agatha, you're just sore that Luann taught me all of her talented tricks of the trade when in the kitchen instead of you whenever you came over. Oh, and you're very welcome, Ash, he finished with a smile at the younger male. Agatha simply huffed and sipped her tea as Brock looked at Fuji with interest. So your wife was a good cook? Fuji nodded as he poured himself a cup of tea. Oh yes, most definitely. Before she became a tower keeper, Luan traveled the region and worked at some of the finest culinary establishments in Kanto, all while working under some of the greatest chefs of the time. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, Brock, but she even worked for a time at the Golden Magikarp as the sous chef. No sooner did the words leave Fuji's lips and Brock practically had his mouth hanging open. Are you kidding me, Mr. Fuji? Of course I've heard of the Golden Magikarp. My mother was a famous cook herself and had her own line of cooking recipe and instruction videos that she did for years when I was younger. She was invited to go and become the head chef at the Golden Magikarp, but by then she was already married to my father and had become a mother. She was forced to pass up on the opportunity, but I've always dreamed of visiting that restaurant. Fuji smiled and tipped his teacup to Brock. Quite an accomplishment your mother made if she was being offered such a prestigious position. Very impressive indeed. Ash suddenly waved his hands in the air for a halt. Wait a minute, Brock. You said that your mom had her own cooking instructional videos. What was her name? Brock appeared a little confused at the question but answered anyway, Lisa Stone. She did her own series of cooking shows for years, all the way up until she died of cervical cancer. Ash sat back in his chair and seemed happily surprised. Brock, my mom couldn't cook a thing when she and my father first got together. She had to learn from these cooking videos that was taught by a woman named Lisa Stone. Brock also looked surprised for a few moments but then smiled. Hey, what do you know? I was really impressed by your mom's cooking ability and wanted her to teach me what she knew if she ever got the chance, but it turns out that her and my own mom were more alike than I thought. Who would have guessed Mrs. Ketchum learned to get so good at cooking from my mother? He crossed his arms and chuckled. Small world. Ash grinned and pointed between them both. I guess you and me were always meant to be friends, huh, Brock? The older boy merely smiled and nodded. You know, Ash, I think you're right. Suddenly, Misty spoke up in an irritated voice, will someone please tell me what the Golden Magikarp is? Everyone except for Ash looked at the orange-haired girl like she was more than a little flighty in the head. Brock especially seemed shocked as he raised an eyebrow. Seriously, Misty, you've never heard of the Golden Magikarp? Ash spoke up as Misty shook her head, neither have I. The teen looked at them both, stunned, for a moment before leaning forward on the table and explaining, well, the Golden Magikarp is basically the most famous restaurant in all of Kanto and is located in Celadon City. It's the full 5-star experience and everything. Complete with indoor theater, live shows that are performed regularly, a rooftop pool and lounge, 5 floors of the most stunning atmospheric eating conditions you've ever seen, and the menu is super extensive. Not only can you get some of the most famous dishes found anywhere here in Kanto at this particular restaurant, but you can also get exotic dishes prepared for you that comes from faraway regions like Sinnoh, Unova and even Kalos. Ash leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms while whistling. Wow, sounds fancy. Giselle nodded and took a sip of her tea. Yeah, and not to mention extremely expensive. And I mean like, really expensive. Only the wealthiest and most high-class people in society eat there. Even celebrities and other famous figures from here and other regions go to the Golden Magikarp. My family eats there pretty often and it really is a very nice place. Brock looked at Giselle like she had just slapped his face and called him homosexual when she said that she had already been to the Golden Magikarp and multiple times at that apparently. Said brunette looked over at Misty without noticing that Brock was simply staring at her with wide eyes. So you've really never heard of the Golden Magikarp before, Misty? The slightly taller female glared slightly at Giselle even though the other girl didn't mean to intentionally rub her family's good fortune in anyone's faces. No, I haven't, for your information. Some of us don't come from super wealthy families that can afford to send their daughters to snobbish technical schools and eat all the time at 5-star restaurants either. Giselle glared back at Misty since she could hear the subtly barbed comments the younger girl was making, but just before they could get into one of their nasty rounds, Fuji spoke up to diffuse the tension. Yes, I've only been there once myself and everything Miss Giselle and Brock talks about concerning it is most definitely true. The Golden Magikarp is the nicest place you'll ever go to eat it here in Kanto, and unlike many other high-rise eating establishments that charge unbelievable prices for small portions of food that is only somewhat adequate, the Golden Magikarp more than lives up to its reputation of being the best. Their food is far beyond incredible. I remember it from the time I went there with Agatha as her guest at a celebratory dinner for the Elite Four. Agatha smiled fondly and held her teacup close to her mouth. Ah yes, I remember that night well. It was right after little Lori managed to get into the Elite Four and we all went out to celebrate her success. Which was well earned considering how hard we all were on her during the trials, especially Lance. But, then again, he was the same way with me, so I wasn't really all that surprised at her rough treatment, I suppose. Misty's head seemed to turn on a swivel as she looked at Agatha with big eyes, her near fight with Giselle all but totally forgotten. Wait, did you just say Lori? As in, Lorelei of the Elite Four. Water Mistress and Ice-type Master of Kanto. That Lorelei. Agatha looked at Misty and chuckled amusedly. I see you are a fan of hers, and yes, that's exactly who I am talking about. The youngest Waterflower sister seemed to form stars in her eyes as she nodded rapidly. Of course I am. She's my biggest inspiration, even more so than Wallace, the champion of the Hoenn region. They're both big-time water Pokémon masters, but Lorelei is my favorite. She always seems so cool and collected anytime she battles on TV, and the way she commands her water and ice-type Pokémon is it's just incredible. Being how my dream is to become a water Pokémon master too, Lorelei is my greatest idol. Agatha chuckled again and took another sip of her tea. Well, I can tell you that you picked the right person to idolize, Misty. Lorelei is a very kind, sweet and fiercely intelligent woman who loves Pokémon a great deal. She's definitely a genius when it comes to raising water and ice types, and is always a great thrill to battle against or even to watch battle from the sidelines. I've known her ever since she was just a young lady, first getting into the league as the youngest member of our Elite Four, and I quickly took her under my wing, so to speak. We developed a very close bond over time, and now she's like the daughter I never had. The older woman winked at Misty. I guarantee she would love to meet someone as spirited about water types as you, Misty. In fact, you even remind me of her a little bit when she was younger. While Misty and Agatha chatted away about Lorelei, Brock turned his attention back to Fuji. Hey Mr. Fuji. I was just wondering, if you don't mind and depending on how long we're here for, that is, would you maybe consider teaching me some of the ways that you cook? You're really good, way better than me, and I would be honored to learn from you. Fuji just laughed and reached out to pat Brock's shoulder since he was sitting right next to him. Well, I think you give me a little too much credit and not enough for yourself, young man, but I would be honored and happy to work with you. Brock smiled widely and bowed his head to Fuji. Thank you, Mr. Fuji, I really appreciate it. I hope I do get a chance to learn from you. After that, the table descended into small chatter amongst everyone for a little while before Agatha suddenly spoke up, addressing Ash. I must say, young man, that I am very impressed by yourself and Brock's cooking abilities when it comes to Pokémon food. When you two went to feed all the Pokémon, I didn't think my own would eat the mix you made since they are always so picky, but I was wrong. Fuji nodded. Yes, mine are rather picky as well, but they ate your food with no issues. I am quite impressed. Ash and Brock just shrugged and laughed modestly before the younger of the two answered, yeah, well, Brock is better than me, I think. My mom taught me how to make food for my Pokémon, and I've been working to get better at it ever since. I don't know about that, Ash, Brock intervened. I may be the better when it come to making human food, but I'd say we're about equal when it comes to Pokémon. You're really good at it, and I wouldn't short yourself out. Misty and Giselle both nodded in agreement while simply humming their agreement since their mouths were full. Ash scratched his cheek with one finger and smiled. Ah well, I appreciate it, Brock, thanks. He looked over then at Pikachu, Squirtle, Charmander and Bulbasaur, who were still eating their own food a little ways away from the table. I just like knowing that I can make food my Pokémon enjoy, that's all. Agatha glanced at where Ash was looking for a moment before speaking to the boy once more. I must also say that I am very impressed with how you raise your Pokémon, young man. There are ways in which to tell for each species of Pokémon just how healthy they are, and for yours I can easily tell it. Pikachu's coat is very glossy and sleek, and the electric sacs on its cheek are a vibrant red. Squirtle's shell looks to be very firm and well taken care of without a crack to be seen, which is a sign of very good health in its species. Charmander's tail flame is one of the healthiest and brightest that I have ever seen on one of its kind, so that says all I need to know concerning it. And as for your Bulbasaur, the bulb on its back appears to be very healthy, full of vitality, and also a very good size. You should be proud. Ash just leaned over one side of his chair and continued to look at his Pokémon before replying, Thanks Agatha, that means a lot coming from you. I do my best for Pokémon and that's all I can do. The boy smiled a little in reminiscence then. I remember the morning I first left for my journey and I was the very first one at Professor Oak's lab. He gave me the top pick between Squirtle, Charmander and Bulbasaur, but my heart was so set on this little Pichu I met in the forests surrounding the ranch years earlier, I just couldn't pick any of them. Ash's eyes turned to land on Pikachu where he smiled a little more. It turns out that the professor had just captured a Pikachu earlier that morning and when I asked to see it, Pikachu recognized me and I recognized him as the Pichu I saw as a kid years before. He was really angry and ill-tempered at first since Professor Oak had succeeded in capturing him in order to keep him from chewing on the electric lines for the lab, and that was why he was afraid to let me have Pikachu in the first place. He was worried that it was too much for a beginner trainer to handle. But, after Pikachu recognized who I was and we caught up a little, he decided to willingly come along with me. We've been together ever since that day now almost 6 months ago. Ash laughed before shaking his head. I never would have imagined that I'd end up with all 3 Kanto starters anyway. It kind of blows my mind when I think about it and makes me realize just how lucky I am. He then reached for another soft-boiled egg while Agatha smiled fondly at his little story and puts one on his plate before looking at it for a minute. He then looked up at Agatha again and grinned a little cheesily. To be honest, I'm just really hoping that eventually this little mind block I have with eating meat will eventually go away. I still make myself eat it, but taking this Pidgey egg for instance, I have such a hard time now that I've become a trainer and have my own Pokémon, eating any kind of food made out of one. Before I became a trainer I never thought too much about it, but now that I've been raising my own Pokémon, it just seems so. I don't know, wrong somehow. Especially since one of my first Pokémon was a Pidgey. Agatha actually gave a little chuckle, as well as Fuji, before taking a sip of her tea. No Ash, you don't need to feel bad about that at all, it just means you're normal and have a heart. Now if you would have said instead that you had no troubles eating Pokémon meat after becoming a trainer, I would have questioned the state of your head. She set her cup down and pointed at him as she smiles. What you're feeling right now is completely normal, young man. When I first started out as a Pokémon trainer I was so conflicted about eating anything made out of Pokémon that I became a vegetarian. Unfortunately, living a life as physically exerting as the one a trainer lives while on the road is not one for a vegetarian, and I quickly had to rethink things if I didn't want to run myself into the ground from lack of energy. She then leaned forward on her elbows and laced her fingers together. I eventually had to come to realize something. And that was this. Everything and everyone in this life has a place in the cycle of life and nature. We all live for a particular purpose, no matter what it may end up being, and we are all meant to die in a particular way suited for each individual. People and Pokémon come and then they go, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Yes, certain species of Pokémon are farmed as food for humans and even other Pokémon, but it's not done as an evil act by heartless people, for the most part anyway. Arceus made humans and Pokémon to coexist, yes, but also to help each other live and prosper. Without the species of Pokémon we have that serve as a large source of our food, many people all over the world would starve. Including the certain types of Pokémon that depend on a large protein source in their diet which only comes from meat for their nourishment needs, instead of pure vegetation. If all Pokémon consumption stopped tomorrow, then not only would people suffer but many types of Pokémon that are carnivorous would starve and perish as well. Add on to that, the Pokémon species who were being used as livestock would start to overpopulate and grow too large for their chosen home environments to sustain them. They eventually would also start to go hungry from lack of findable food and even develop sicknesses and diseases due to said overpopulation. Agatha smiled warmly at Ash and the other young trainers at the table. So you see, life and everything in it has a circle that it has to follow, from birth to death. If people or Pokémon try to interfere and mess with nature, then the same world that nourishes us would eventually start to suffer and wither until nothing remained. Eventually killing any and everything on this planet in the process. It's a harsh and dramatic example, I know, but no less true. We are all a part of this world, and even the slightest bit of interference towards the natural order of things could cause chaos. Agatha then gestured at Ash. Tell me, young man, is your Pidgey healthy, happy and growing strong? The boy smiled brightly at the mention of one of his Pokémon and nodded right away. Yeah, she's doing really well and is actually already a Pidgeot. She's really strong and fast too. The old woman smiled and had to refrain from chuckling again at Ash's almost constant infectious enthusiasm. Well then you see Ash. Your Pidgey wasn't meant to be one of the ones who is bred for livestock. Instead she was born in the wild and her destiny has led her to a talented young trainer that will help make her stronger and happier than she could ever hope to be by herself. Not every Pokémon in a species that can be used for produce will be, and many of them go on to live happy, fulfilled lives in other ways. Either with a Pokémon trainer, human friend of some kind, or maybe even find happiness on their own. Fuji then spoke up and addressed Ash and his friends. What Agatha is saying essentially is not to feel bad for playing your own roles in the circle of life. We don't eat Pokémon because we're malicious or bad people, we do it because it's how we survive and is also how Arceus meant for things to be. Everything has a purpose, everything lives and everything dies. It's just nature. The young group of trainers appeared thoughtful for a few moments before, one by one, they all nodded in understanding and acceptance. You know, that actually does make a lot of sense, Ash conceded as he looked at Fuji and Agatha. I never honestly thought of all that to such a degree or put it in such a way before. You're right though, both of you. People and Pokémon are all a part of life, and just like everything else that lives, we also have a way in which we have to die and a purpose for why we do so. It doesn't do me or anyone else any good to feel bad about or try to change what is naturally done by nature. Brock, Misty and Giselle seemed to agree with his words as he smiled and bowed his head. Thank you both for explaining all of that in such a way and helping it to make sense to me. I truly never thought of it in that way, but after hearing it put so sensibly and intelligently, I actually do feel a lot better now about it all. Thank you again, I truly do appreciate it. Agatha got up as she prepared to take the now empty dishes to the sink. Anytime, young man, it was my pleasure. If I can help offer even a little bit of advice or help to a young trainer reaching for the stars, then I am happy to do so. She gestured to the table. Now what say we all pitch in and help clean up the dishes and kitchen him? Yeah, I'll help. Giselle volunteered as she hopped up. Me too, Misty chimed in as she grabbed her own plate and cup and headed to the sink. Well, I helped cook, so I should help clean up afterwards too, Brock said with a chuckle as he got up and pushed his chair in. Ash, however, simply nodded. Yeah, I'll help too, but first I would like to ask you a question if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Fuji. The older man just inclined his head to Ash and waved with his left hand in a welcoming gesture. Please do, Ash. The boy took a few moments to make sure he would be asking in the nicest way possible before beginning. Well, Mr. Fuji, it's just... Haunter is so new to all of this and it hasn't had a chance to fully accustom to life away from the darkness and shadows of the tower yet. I would really like to have some more time with it so I can get to know Haunter better and maybe even help it adjust to life out here in the real world again. Of course, I would also like to see the town a little more and maybe even learn what I can from you and Agatha during the time we're here, so I was wondering if maybe you would mind if we stayed for perhaps another week with you here. Ash held his hands up. We'll help however we can and I'll even pay you so that we're not just a burden on you, that's no issue. If you just don't want us staying, then that's fine too, and we'll find somewhere else to room while we're here, like the Pokémon Center. I just thought that I would ask if you would mind or anything since. Fuji stopped him with a raised hand. Ash, you and your friends are more than welcome to stay with me for as long as you wish to. I'm very happy for the company and you all are great sources of it at that. I also will take no payment of any kind from any of you. You either stay with me free of charge or not at all. Ash looked at his friends and then went over to ask, hey, would you guys be okay if we stayed here for another week or so? Soledad's contest in Saffron isn't for a while yet, so we'll still have more than enough time to get there, I think. Misty shook her head. I'd love to stay, Ash. Maybe Agatha can tell me a little more about Lorelei while we're here. Giselle snickered at Misty but answered her boyfriend, I'd also like to stay, Ash. Maybe we could go and see the town together, just us, while we're at it. Brock was instantly on board. Hey, I'm definitely okay with staying for a while longer. Hopefully Mr. Fuji can teach me some of his great cooking secrets and recipes while we're here. Ash turned back to Fuji once his friends gave their consent and nodded. We'll stay, Mr. Fuji, and thank you, this is very gracious and kind of you. We all greatly appreciate it, he finished as each of them gave a respectful bow to the older man. Fuji gave his own bright smile and held a thumbs up. Okay then, it sounds like I'll be having some great company to count on for the next few days. After that, the group of friends went to help Fuji and Agatha clean up the kitchen before settling down for a quiet evening of fellowship and conversation that was both stimulating and also very humorous at certain points. Especially whenever Misty and Giselle would nearly get into one of their loud, over-the-top shouting matches. All in all though, the evening was a good one and in Ash's opinion, the perfect way to end a very stressful and intense 2 days. While surrounded by his friends, Pokémon in a warm and friendly atmosphere, Ash couldn't help but sit back and reflect on just what the next week would hold for him and the others. And he wasn't disappointed either. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Just as he had hoped, the week turned out to be very eventful, very successful and a learning experience for all of them. Not only had he been spending every day getting to know Hunter better and talking with the ghost type at every chance he had, but he had also been, believe it or not, training with Agatha during that same time. It had all started when she walked in on he and his Pokémon training together in the gym during the physical improvement and integrated training portion of their workout session. She watched them for a time and then observed as Ash started to run them through the paces with move training, attack and defensive maneuvering, speed, strength and agility drills, battle tactics and strategy, partner and all-out sparring, and even the special skills portion of their regimen. Which was basically where Ash would break them down into working on utilizing their abilities and even special techniques he was helping them to create, all while in practice battle. There was quite a few other smaller areas of focus Ash put emphasis on, but those were the ones in which he put the most focus to and really drilled his Pokémon on. And of course, even though he was just coming off of a close brush with death and had minor injuries, he refused to let his Pokémon train alone and was right out on the floor doing his own intense workout right beside of them. Something Agatha had found quite impressive. Something she also found to be rather impressive was the intelligent, well-structured and properly integrated ways in which Ash went about training his Pokémon. Each one was done systematically and with special focus and detailed attention for not only each Pokémon's unique type differences but also the little things that made them unique and special as individuals. Agatha was at first surprised and almost a little worried at the over-the-top intensity Ash trained he and his Pokémon at, and found his methods to be in some ways almost, well, brutal. Especially after he would roll over from a set of elevated chair pike push-ups covered in sweat and then shout at his Pokémon to do more, go faster and be stronger. Even as the Pokémon themselves were gasping for air, sweating in some cases and nearly on the verge of what appeared to be collapse in others. However, after their training was finally done, she saw a complete change in Ash from militaristic, brutal coach to kind, caring young trainer that loved his Pokémon. Meaning that he would go to each one and check them over for serious wounds, patch up any cuts they had and then rehydrate and wipe the sweat off of them with care and patience after training was complete. Seeing such a thing made Agatha feel more at ease that he wasn't just some slave driver trainer like so many other young and even older Pokémon trainers she knew of. He actually cared for them, and it showed in his actions when he would dote over them after their workouts were finished. The fact that he even trained with them was something that made her smile, since she personally believed that the best way to bring out a Pokémon's true potential was to train with them and give it your all. If they see you going for it intently, then they'll be more inclined to follow your example versus if you were a lazy bum of a trainer who only sat around on your rump and barked out orders all day. Monkey see as monkey do, like they say after all. In fact, watching Ash train reminded her of her old friend Sam Oak when he was a young man training his own Pokémon. He was also very structured, intelligent, diverse and precise when training, just as Ash was. Something she could yet again see coming out of the boy as proof that Oak really was his teacher and mentor. Still though, Ash may have been similar to Oak in some ways when he trained, but the very harsh intensity he added to it gave the boy his own special flair and spice to he and his Pokémon's training regimen. The way he went from harsh trainer to a loving one during and after training respectively was what really made his style unique in her eyes. Unbeknownst to her, however, Ash had known that she was watching him train, and for that reason alone, he had purposefully not had his Pokémon go too in-depth with their tactical, strategical or special techniques training since, call him paranoid, Ash didn't want Agatha seeing all of their techniques and secret methods to their battling style. It's not that he didn't trust her, but in Ash's mind, someday he would be battling her and he didn't want the much more experienced trainer having any first-hand knowledge or insight into their true battling abilities if he could help it. What did surprise him though was when Agatha approached him after he was finished training and asked him if he would like to train and learn under her for the time in which they were all together at Fuji's 4. Obviously, being offered an opportunity of training from a member of the Elite Four was way too good of a chance to pass up, so he took her up on her offer right away. Over the week, Agatha didn't so much work with Ash and his Pokémon on first-hand battling and physical training as she did battling and general Pokémon theory. In-depth type explanations, stories she shared of some of her more intense battling experiences as well as those she witnessed of others, how to handle the extreme pressure of performing in front of a stadium full of people during the Pokémon League conference tournaments, as well as little-known tricks, tips and strategies she had developed over the years that were unique to her. What was really beneficial about the whole situation though was how when Agatha was instructing Ash one-on-one, she would have all of her own Pokémon gather Ashes together and then get them to share advice, impart valuable knowledge and instruct the much younger and more inexperienced Pokémon on many different things that was only learned and encountered through years of experience and a life full of intensive battling. Ash, just like his Pokémon, took in all that the highly respected and seasoned professionals had to offer them just like a sponge, soaking in every bit of information given to them. Especially the parts on how to handle pressure at crowded matches during the Pokémon League, since that was one thing that Ash had no clue on how to train his Pokémon, or even himself for that matter, to handle such things since they had never been in such an atmosphere so full of pressure before. Agatha, however, made it very simple for them in theory. She simply explained that when you stepped onto that field during a league conference or any other major event taking place in front of a large crowd, you simply had to focus and center your mind on the here and now. You had to zone out everything that was going on around you and have your attention focused on nothing but the battle ahead, your Pokémon and the way in which your opponents were battling, so you could find a way to exploit their weaknesses and then strike hard at them. She told Ash that when battling in such conditions, the trainer and their Pokémon had to be able to tune out the crowd, the announcer and even the cameras if the particular event was being televised like the Indigo Conference was. No amount of noise or fanfare could distract you, because if you let it, your battle was as good as over. Especially if you were battling against an opponent that was very skilled and did know how to tune out the crowd. Agatha further went on to explain one of the main reasons why first-time newbies and even trainers that had a few years of experience under their belts hardly ever went on to make it very far in a league tournament or other similar types of events. The reason basically being that nerves would choke them and then the distraction would kill them.